All right, so I'll take a moment then and say welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening for our panel discussion for our current fourth iteration of Made in Harlem, which is reconsidering Harlem legacies and futures. I'm Annie Horner. I'm one of the programmers at Maysles Documentary Center. Maysles Documentary Center is a film exhibition and education space that's based in Harlem on 127th and Lenox. Currently, all of our programming, as well as our education programs that are running at this time, are online in our virtual cinema and in our virtual classroom. We have a couple of exciting programs coming up later this month, and a fair amount more programming coming up later in the year. So definitely check out our website at maysles.org. You can join our mailing list there. You can follow us on the standard social media places, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. This week, we are going to be joining the premiere of the environmental documentary, The People versus Agent Orange. We'll also be opening Backward Walking Forward next week for its 10-year anniversary. And also later this weekend, we will be launching our second Youth Media Film Festival, which is curated and run by our Teen Producers Academy. So again, be sure to check out some of those programs later this month. I'd like to thank the West Harlem Development Corporation for making tonight's panel and the Made in Harlem series possible for the past 4 years. We are going to be accepting audience questions in the Q&A function that you can see down at the bottom of your screen. If you have any comments or questions for our panelists this evening, you can submit them there, and then we'll reserve a portion of the end of the conversation this evening for your questions. And yeah, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator for tonight, who is also the curator for the Made in Harlem series, who is Andrea Battleground. He'll be taking it from here. And Andrea is a film librarian, archival researcher, programmer, and grateful Harlem resident. She has conducted memory and preservation work among the treasures of the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, the History Makers Oral History Archive, the Charlotte Hawkins Brown Museum, and the Gates Preserve and Archive. She is also a writer and editor contemplating the ways in which media is ephemeral and permanent. Her work has appeared in the AV Club, BuzzFeed, and the Undercover Classics collection. So I will turn it over to Andrea. Thanks so much.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us, and welcome to this panel discussion presented as part of Reconsidering Harlem, Legacies and Futures, the 4th annual Made in Harlem series. As Annie mentioned, I'm Andrea Battleground, curator of the series and grateful Harlem resident. In Sharifa Rhodes Pitt's book, Harlem is Nowhere, she poses the question, how long must one live in Harlem to be able to write a book about Harlem? I asked myself a very similar question. How long must one live in Harlem to create a program considering its legacies? I don't have an answer to that question, but I do know this. I lived in Harlem for 6.5 years. When I moved here, I very quickly met a group of creatives and culture workers who were also Black and new to the city. And we bonded a bit over trying to figure out life in New York. I very quickly discovered that out of this incredible group of brand new transplants, I was the only one living in Harlem. And we would talk and they used to laugh and say, oh, you live all the way up there? Why? You won't have a community. Harlem is done. Harlem is dead. So fast forward to 2020, And one of the things I did to cope during our pandemic year was I walked. During a time when everything seemed ephemeral and precarious, I walked the streets of Harlem the way I did when I first arrived. And because I'm an archivist, a memory worker, and I know so much of legacy is in the placemaking, I went to the actual spots and I thought about Harlem stories and I did an accounting. Oh, this is where the Hotel Teresa was. This was Small's Paradise. This was the Victoria Theater. This was Louis Michaud's bookstore. This was Dapper Dan's boutique. This was. Okay, so then I thought, so what is still here? The Harlem YMCA is still here. The Schomburg is here. The Apollo Theater is here. But you know what else is here? The people. The people are here. Harlem is alive. So then I considered the stories we tell because I study film and I engage with the world by means of the moving image. So I went to the archive. I went looking for every film that I could access that depicted Harlem, but especially any documentaries. I thought about what Harlem stories are captured on film and how and why these stories have survived. What resulted is this first part of Made in Harlem 2021. These are stories that left their mark on me. I hope that they serve as a clarity, but also as an instigation, a way to interrogate which narratives persist and which scenarios of Harlem take up space and by whose design. I'm grateful to the staff at Maysles Documentary Center for adjusting to this approach during a time absolutely overwhelmed with adjustments. And I'm grateful to be joined by 3 dynamic visionaries working on Harlem's film future and who will be in conversation this evening. So allow me to introduce them. Karen D. Taylor is director of the film In the Face of What We Remember, Oral Histories of 409 and 555 Edgecombe Avenue. She's also founder and executive director of While We Are Still Here, an organization that includes long-term residents of both buildings and was formed as a response to the threat that the building's rich history would be lost to time and gentrification. Taylor consults as the director of public history for Columbia University Teachers College's Harlem Education History Project. She has also curated several art exhibits related to Harlem's history and has appeared as vocalist or playwright for Women in Jazz, Jazz in the Valley, and the New York International Fringe Festival. She has been a Harlem resident for more than 30 years. So welcome, Karen Taylor.
Thank you.
C.R. Capers is the founder and CEO of Harlem Film House, which provides creators with services and resources intended to ensure longevity in their careers in film, theater, and related pursuits, particularly in underserved communities around the world. In her role as executive director, CR creates and produces film and music festivals. She operates workshops, theater productions, and live events, programming that provides a generative ecosystem with strategic partnerships among filmmakers, activists, businesses, entrepreneurs, and the community at large. Capers is the founder of the Hip Hop Film Festival. She is the host of the Why You Mad Son podcast and the director or producer of 3 feature films and 2 shorts through her company, MBS Films. So please welcome C.R. Capers.
Thank you for having me.
Marcia Smith is the president and co-founder of Firelight Media, which produces documentary films, provides artistic and financial support to emerging filmmakers of color, and builds impact campaigns to connect documentaries to audiences and social justice advocates. Under her leadership, Firelight Media was honored with a MacArthur Award for Creative and Effective Institutions. The flagship documentary lab program has supported more than 80 emerging filmmakers over the past decade. Marcia Smith has written several films alongside documentarian Stanley Nelson and has been nominated for a Primetime Emmy, has won a Writers Guild Award for the documentary The Murder of Emmett Till, has been honored with a 2016 Muse Award from New York Women in Film and Television, as well as the 2019 Luminary Award from the Black Star Film Festival. Shout out Black Star. She serves as a member of the Academy of Motion Pictures Arts and Sciences, and she sits on the board of directors for the Peabody, the Martha's Vineyard Film Society, and the International Documentary Association. Welcome, Marcia Smith.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you all. Okay, let's get started. So I will repeat Annie's suggestion to place any questions you have for our panelists in the Q&A. And I would like to start by asking, what circumstances compelled each of you to founding your organizations? And I will go ahead and start with Karen.
Okay. We started the organization in Harlem because of the prospect of the history being completely eradicated through time and gentrification. And also because I live in Harlem. I've lived here for almost 35 years. And this is the place my grandparents came to from Barbados in search of, riches, the whole thing. The streets were paved with gold. And my grandparents came here and they lived here for many years. And I was also born here on 110th Street and Lenox Avenue, although I was not raised here. I was raised in St. Albans, Queens. And essentially, the history of Harlem is so rich and so vast. And with the whole dynamic of gentrification occurring at such a rapid pace, we said, we really have to do something to help codify the history. And we started with 409 and 555 Edgecombe Avenue, and we kind of expanded out to Harlem in the broader sense.
Okay, CR, how about you?
Well, I am a Harlemite, born and bred. I was born here in Harlem. I grew up in Esplanade Gardens. And while I have traveled extensively throughout my life, Harlem is still my home. And when I decided to begin my business, there was no place else I would rather be or do it at, simply because, it is the epitome of fresh. It is where where I feel the true spirit of the community comes from, particularly that entrepreneurial spirit. So when I began the Harlem Film House and the Hip Hop Film Festival, it was to make sure creatives could mend their creative side with their developing business mind, and then offer the resources to make sure that they had access and opportunity. My mom was a follower of Martin Luther the King, and my dad was a Panther. More so when Huey got more radicalized, and it was more of the ends justify the means type of situation. So, but both of them very committed to the liberation of Black folk. And then therefore being able to provide a revolution of the mind for every human on the planet. So it's with those principles in mind that the Harlem Film House and the Hip Hop Film Festival was established. And I do my work here, and then I go outside of the world the rest of the year to Africa, Asia, Europe, East Africa, West Africa, South Africa, to explore also and help those people in those countries explore their entrepreneurial pursuits in film deserts around the world. So that's what you do.
And Marcia, what compelled the founding of Firelight Media?
Well, at the time, and we're 20 years old. I can hardly fix my lips to say it, that we're 20 years old. And I started Firelight with my partner, Stanley Nelson. And I think our instinct was, Stanley had always worked in documentary. And I started working with him. The first film I worked on was called Soldiers Without Swords. It's about Black newspapers. And we knew, because that film took 7 years to make, that it was an unsustainable way to make a living. Being a documentary filmmaker was 20 years ago and remains a largely unsustainable way to make a living. And I want to say that, for us, trying to develop an organization that would build some infrastructure around documentary filmmaking would allow us to kind of speed up the pace of production was the initial inspiration. I think what's happened over the course of the last 20 years is we have broadened our focus to try to help other people be able to do that, and to be increasingly actually try to advocate for the kinds of changes that will make it more sustainable, because we firmly believe that we need documentary filmmakers, that they have a job with respect to Black liberation, that project, the ongoing project, and that we want to do everything that we can to try to, bring more people in, support their artistic development, and figure out how to make it so that they can stay. Because we, to this day, also lose people because of the kind of, we're very, very concerned about things that have happened in the last year, because as with all things, the pandemic revealed the kind of fault lines and the fragility of trying to make a living in this field for many, many people. So, that remains a big motivator for us as an organization.
And I want to pay particular attention to the legends or the myths about Harlem that are facing outward, that make their way out. Because as someone coming in as a relative newcomer, especially among this group, right? I, of course, knew about the Harlem Renaissance and the Black arts movement, right? That kind of not necessarily resurgent, but it's an additional Harlem story about the Kamwenge collective, et cetera, that was in Harlem. But what Marcia, what you're getting at there is a kind of attention to making sure that there's longevity as opposed to individual signposts or individual stories, individual time periods. When I was curating this, I paid particular attention to what the film is saying about a Harlem then, and also what it's saying about Harlem now. And I think that there's a lot there. So I guess my question to you is, from what I know in my studies, William Greaves, for example, paid particular attention to making sure that a next generation of documentarians had support. So it's almost like a family tree in a sense, where you can kind of trace the mentorship. So like William Greaves mentored St. Clair Bourne. And once you widen the net and talk about Black Journal, for example, you can include Horace B. Jenkins, and you can include Madeline Anderson, and you can include all kinds of people that worked on that. And I know that a significant part of what you're doing with Firelight is to create an infrastructure for not only the documentaries that you are making, but the next generation of filmmakers. So how important is it to create a longevity that these things won't be an anomaly, right? That there can be an entire system of filmmakers that can be supported in Harlem.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's critically important. It's, interesting you mentioned Bill Greaves because he was Stanley's mentor also. Um, Stanley, in fact, when he was getting his start as a filmmaker, he actually lived with Bill Greaves, and he learned film he went to film school, but he learned how to make a film with Bill Greaves. And by doing everything on Bill's projects, we now have a fund that's named after Bill Greaves. It's called the William Greaves Development Fund. And, I think that sense of legacy and responsibility it's very, very important, and important even as a kind of value that we want to promote. The reason we started that fund is because after running the documentary lab for 10 years, we noticed the experience of some of our filmmakers was that, they had a very successful first film, maybe second film. They won festival awards, they got good reviews, and then they couldn't make another film because they were pigeonholed in the industry, because the industry is set up to respond to individual ideas and not artists who want to build a body of work. So we raised the money to re-grant this money, and the fund is open, by the way, for any in the audience who are mid-career filmmakers. You have to have a record established already, but the fund is open to mid-career filmmakers who need some support to get a new project off the ground. And what you're saying about legacy and having a collective story is something that we think about all the time. Because we operate in this society and this industry that promotes and prizes individual achievement, and leverages individual achievement as a weapon against collective advancement. That's something that we try to keep in the forefront of what we do, and how we talk about it is also important.
So I will move to CR because I have a specific question about, in reading your bio, I noticed that Harlem Film House is doing so many things and is able to not necessarily just specialize in film, right? You specifically mentioned theater productions. You specifically have, I want to say you host a podcast, right? I don't know what the podcast is focused on, but I just noticed that you are specifically focused on film, but you also have a music festival that you're involved with, and you have these other media outlets. And I'm just wondering, like, for Harlem Film House, what do you think, aside from it being your home, but what do you think being based in Harlem brings to the organization?
Well, I think it brings the fact that anyone can be a storyteller and create an entrepreneurial conversation where community is at the core, and make it accessible for everyone. Harlem has always been the gateway of culture. It has been the gateway of fashion, style, cool, of course. So that's what it brings. And it's also the hope, right?
Mhm.
I've seen more people come through Harlem and get their dreams answered, if you will, more than any other space in the world, myself included. So I want to be that beacon to attract globally the fact that anyone can be a storyteller, whether you call it film, whether you call it media, whether you call it podcast, we're all telling stories. And we should all be able to feed our communities, employ our brothers, our sisters, our friends, our cousins, Auntie, Pookie, and them. Everybody can be employed through film and media. I have seen it when Detroit closed down because they stopped making automobiles. That wiped out the middle class in Black America and America as a whole, correct? Why is it that we were not taught that the new middle class and upper middle class and rich could be done just by having jobs in film. And I'm not talking about being the actor. The most money is the person that writes a check is the studio, right? It's the distribution hubs. The actors are but a small part in that. We're not taught that. We're not taught that gaffers can make upwards of $75,000 a year to start flicking on lights and knowing how things run. I know plenty of little boys that can make whole cars out of wires. You mean to tell me they can't turn on a light and now feed their community and feed their families and create training programs? So this is why Harlem Film House is essential. No one is, I can't say no one. It is my mission to make sure that that message is amplified, and then not only talk about it, but be about it. It is important that we be the example and we be the progress that we want to see. So yes, I do absolutely everything. I am podcasting, I am making movies, I am helping people, I'm giving away money, I'm giving away fiscal sponsorships. I don't care what level you are at. Harlem Film House is here to assist, to help free of charge or at low cost. Doesn't matter where you are in the industry. So that's what I want to portray. Everybody is a filmmaker, everybody is a storyteller, and you can employ and save your community with film, with story. And enjoy yourself. I love movies. We need all the stories. We need all the stories, right? So that's what Harlem brings to it.
That is such a great point, because there, even among familiar stories, right, there is a perspective that is missing, or that there is an aspect that has been excluded or what have you. And that brings me to Karen. I want to speak a little bit about your film, because one thing that I found particularly refreshing, because I thought that I knew a whole lot about this time period, right? But watching your film, I really appreciated the way that you provided some context to several women's stories. I especially remember the introduction you made for Eslanda Good Robeson. And the context was that she was this amazing, what do you call it, pathologist, right? She had a whole thing going on in her own right, in addition to being the partner of Paul Robeson, right? And you did that several times in the film. I really appreciated that. So I wanted to touch upon the ways in which you added so much texture to those, what we think of as familiar stories, but are not necessarily. Another detail that I really, really loved was one of the residents, and I'm blanking on her name, but she was a musician, and she's been there for 80 years in that one building.
Uh-huh.
And she tells the story about how she was a little girl and she was starting to play the cello, and Thurgood Marshall would always carry her cello because he said it was just so big for her. So that's not a story that we hear very much when contextualizing Thurgood Marshall, right? So I just wanted to ask you about the making of your film and these oral histories that you incorporate.
Well, essentially in 2016, myself and Mike Tyner went around to 409 and 555 Edgecombe Avenue, and also a young filmmaker a videographer named Azure McBride. We went around and essentially interviewed some of the elders of 409 and 555 Edgecombe Avenue, and Laverne Gaither, who you mentioned in relationship to Thurgood Marshall. It took a long time for us to get that actual interview, but it was so wonderful because she's like completely lucid. She's like 90 years old and she's got all of these extraordinary memories. And so while we are still here is like a heritage preservation organization. And the documentary that we did was done under that umbrella. And it was really important for us to be able to gather those oral histories of 409 and 555 Edgecombe Avenue. I've lived at 555 Edgecombe Avenue for, I guess, almost 26, 27 years. And when I first moved here, I mean, I'd hear these things like, oh, Paul Robeson lived upstairs in the penthouse, and Joe Louis lived over there, and Lena Horne used to come visit the building to see Joe Louis. And I said to my partner at the time, I said, well, I'm going to do these oral histories. But because I'm a great procrastinator, it took me 20 years to, finally get a video crew together, and to go around and say, wow, we have got to like gather this history because it will be lost and gone forever due to the, movement of time, and also due to this dynamic force of gentrification. So that is how we kind of developed the film In the Face of What We Remember. And that actually is a line from a Langston Hughes poem called Harlem. And he says, what are we going to do in the face of what we remember? And so, it becomes very, very important for us to gather these oral histories. So, people are cognizant of the fact that Harlem was not only the site of the Harlem Renaissance, Harlem was not only the site of, this debilitating poverty and pathology, Harlem was this really extraordinary incubator for all of these different things that happened, to, I guess, Black America. Of course, we had the Harlem Renaissance, but we also had, like you mentioned, Kamoinge, and there were all of these kind of forces that were happening that were very, very influential. And that's what we tried to capture in the film.
So I want to talk just a bit about these stories that make it out, right? And this isn't necessarily a conversation about the films in the series, but one of the films in the series that I really struggled with including was The Quiet One. And it's a film from the 40s about a 10-year-old Black boy named Donald who it is deemed has behavioral issues. And so he is sent to a school in upstate New York called the Wick Academy, I believe. And I've seen this film before, but I happened to find a programming note where it was shown to teens, right? It was recommended as a teen program, and it was shown as a double feature with The Red Balloon. So very briefly, The Red Balloon is a French film, very surreal, and it has a sentient balloon. And so I thought about, for what purpose would these two films be shown together to children? And what would the narrative leaving that double feature be? And I also thought about the fact that The Quiet One got such a warm reception when it was released, right? It was called several firsts. It was the first mainstream film to feature a Black boy as its protagonist, right? It's considered by many to be among the first of the docudrama genre. There was even for a while like a subgenre that was called, I want to say noir docudrama or something like that, that deals very specifically with folks that are having an emotional or psychological issue. And then I read a lot of press around The Quiet One, and the reviews and the filmmakers, and they had these amazing lines like, "The boy is Negro, the slum is Harlem, but neither of those should be thought of again because the boy is everyone." And I thought, well, isn't that interesting, this framework, right? Isn't it worth noting that the only way to engage and encourage empathy with the audience is to figure out a way to place vagaries around something that's very specific. I don't think that it's irrelevant that this boy is Black. I don't think it's irrelevant that this is happening in Harlem, right? There are some very specific, like the closing line of that film is something like, the Wiltwick School exists to provide an interruption before returning to the very bowels of the city. I want to say that's almost a direct quote. And so I was thinking very specifically about, well, is this truly a coming of age story for Donald? Or is this a savior story for someone else? And so I bring that up in this context because I think it's very important when you're dealing with the legacy of the archive to talk about the stories that survive, the stories that persist. And I think that the narrative around this film deserves some complicating. And I think that, as Karen, you alluded to, it's important to include more stories. And the way that you described it, CR, so eloquently was that all of these people involved are storytellers, right? And so it's important that they start seeing themselves that way and get the tools, right? The resources that are required to engage and participate. So I bring all of that to the fore because I want to ask you specifically, who do you feel most accountable to? And I think that we will start with Marcia.
I think, you know, in the film work that we do, I think we feel accountable to the audience broadly, but to the people who live the story specifically. So, you know, it's really important to us that the people whose stories we have the privilege of telling think that we get it right. You know, that doesn't mean that we get every nuance right. It doesn't mean we get every nuance right, but it does mean that we get, you know, if they see the film as a whole, that they consider it to be an accurate depiction, not the only one perhaps, but an accurate depiction of their experience, a piece of their experience. So I think that's the number one way that we feel accountable. The audience question, I think, and this is something we talk about actually in a lot of different ways, is we feel if we're doing a film about African-American history, that we are speaking to an African-American audience. It's never our goal to explain or to interpret. And that's very conscious because we feel like our job is to reveal something about this, you know, the history, the importance of reconsidering, understanding the history for the ongoing project, as opposed to explaining it so that someone else can recognize us, which, you know, in documentary filmmaking is a huge debate about authenticity. So that's where we come down on that debate.
CR, how about you?
Accountability. I am accountable. I feel accountability towards my legacy, towards humanity. And when I say legacy, you know, I have a daughter, and it's super crucial that I do my part to make sure that the world is a better place. So like in the example you had mentioned where they describe Harlem a certain way, you know, this person's returning to the bowels. I'm Harlem, right? Am I the bowels? I doubt it. No, I'm not the bowels. So everywhere I show up, you know, I am the living representation that you got it wrong, that you were told wrong, and that you have a lot to learn. I'm middle class, piano lessons, debutantes, All of these things that is normal to the rest of the world, why would it not be normal for me? Everywhere in the United States and around the world has a slum. Why is it that Harlem is always considered just a mess of slum? It's not true. And every time I show up, every time I open my mouth, I'm a representation that you have been told a lie. My favorite quote in the world is that in the time of universal deceit, telling the truth will be a universal act. And so that is super important that we make sure that we tell the truth, particularly in our stories. Marcia spoke about being authentic. That is my favorite word, particularly in this industry where part of the work that I do is I take everyone from our festival and then we cull out those that can be acquired by theaters and by Netflix and things like that. And then we present them and we hold the streamers accountable and say, these are authentic stories and you need to offer them a deal and you need to come to the table and you need to do what you're supposed to do. It was a hard road to toe before George Floyd, after, a little bit easier. But it's still the work that needs to be done because guess what? Another George Floyd just died a couple of minutes ago. Another Breonna Taylor just happened another minute ago. So I have to hold my legacy accountable. I have to hold humanity accountable, and I am accountable to it as well. So every day is doing the work of making sure access and opportunity exists for storytellers around the world, and that when the word Harlem is brought up, they know they've met someone from Harlem and they can say, what I learned is incorrect and I need to go watch a documentary, either by Karen or I need to look up Firelight real quick. So that's, that's how I approach it. It's important.
Karen, who do you feel most accountable to?
I think I'd segue from CR and Marcia and just basically say that I feel as though we're accountable to the brilliant, resilient Black people in this country who made this country what it is. And that's all I can say about that, because I mean, Harlem in the public imagination is considered like this horrible slum, like this, poster child for the urban crisis. And it so diminishes the people who lived here and struggled through all of that. And, just created this whole universe of what I call, it's like Harlem was one prolonged event. Like, you start with the great migrations and people come and, you have the Harlem Renaissance, and then you have, all of these things that happen between it. And then you have, Kamoingi, then you have all of these, like the Black is Beautiful movement with Kwame Brathwaite and Ilambe Brathwaite. You have all of this extraordinary stuff, and that does not come from nothing. So essentially, I'm accountable to the resilient population of Black people across the centuries that made Harlem what it is.
Okay, I want to change gears just a little bit because I want to make sure we get to the question of the challenges, particularly in the last year, right? So what would you all say have been your primary challenges in keeping your enterprise going and relevant and agile since its founding and in the age of COVID? Jump right in, anyone who wants to answer.
I mean, my answer is, for our organization, we've done fine. And that is because relative to most BIPOC filmmakers, we are well-funded. I think, however, we witnessed something very serious in terms of how hard hit the Black filmmaking community was this year, which, you know, as in most things, we're the miner's canary. You know, I think, you know, for me, what the year has done is given me a like harder edge on my own analysis and what I'm willing to say out loud. And you know, the nature of the field that we work in is very extractive. You know, where it's extractive of our stories and our labor. And all of those fault lines were kind of revealed in a year in which, you know, people work freelance in this field. People gig, they, you know, they piece it together. You know, if you know how to be a camera person, maybe you're directing your own film at the same time you're being a camera person on somebody else's, and you're, you know, doing some other job. And if you're lucky, you have a partner that has health insurance, if you're lucky, you know. But I think with COVID, you know, people were hit really hard with COVID. Their families were hit really hard. So it was not an abstraction. It wasn't like, let's go get a camera and embed ourselves in Mount Sinai Hospital and capture the story as it unfolds kind of thing. It was like people were really hit. You know, their own families were really hit. Their livelihoods were hit. And that's been really tough. I mean, things are starting to move again for a lot of people. And you know, the way documentaries are now kind of positioned as a piece of entertainment means there is opportunity now. You know, the Floyd moment is having an effect of prying a little bit more opportunity out. I don't know how long that will last. I always worry that that's ephemeral. But for us, it's an opportunity to kind of push on the edges of the kind of systemic changes that we need to make so that we can have people coming into this field in 20 years. And not looking at it like, and this does happen all the time. It's like, you know, I don't know what Karen's experience was, but it's really hard to make it's hard to make a film. It's hard, you know, I heard you say you had to put it down because that's what happens. You know, you have to make a living, you have a family, you have, you know, whatever it is, it's hard. And if this is not your principal source of income, it's a very difficult road to hoe. And if we can't figure out how to make it more feasible, then we have a real problem, because the only people who can do it are, you know, the commissioning people with the money or an individual with a trust fund, and that's not acceptable. So, you know, that's my summary is, you know, for our organization, it was fine, but I think it really indicates a long, long, long way to go that we have to do, and that our role is to push for that, for you know, a different kind of future so that people can survive better.
I'll jump in and say that it was extremely difficult for us to do, you know, in the face of what we remember. And it's an extremely low budget film, but we were compelled. We said, this story has got to be told, because otherwise it will just go the way of the ether and no one will ever know what happened here. And so that's where essentially we were coming from on just trying to make sure that that story was told. And we've got some great footage of the Sugar Hill Quartet. We're developing a documentary around St. Nick's Pub. Some of you may know that St. Nick's Pub was this really venerable night spot on St. Nicholas Avenue, 148th Street. And in its last iteration, it was this really amazing place where people would come, and the Sugar Hill Quartet was the house band, and people would come sit in all night. You know, you'd get there at 10 o'clock, and sometimes you wouldn't leave till 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning. And Wynton Marsalis would come through, Stevie Wonder would come through, Cassandra Wilson would come through, Lewis Nash would come through. All of these internationally renowned people would come through. And so luckily enough, we've got, you know, this whole, probably 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we interviewed 5 people at Bill's place, Bill Saxton, Marcus Persiani, David Gibson, who's the drummer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so we're putting together a documentary around St. Nick's Pub, you know, just to kind of honor the kinds of historic places that were in Harlem. And Yeah, so that's what we're doing.
I'm so happy to hear that, I have to say. I was a patron of St. Nick's Pub in its late days, so I remember it very fondly. I live a few blocks from there, and
Oh, do you?
yeah, we used to love going there late at night. I
Mhm.
remember taking my mother there. My mother's been gone now 15 years, but they had a band night where we
Uh-huh.
could get on the dance floor in the little St. Nick's Pub, and it was great.
Right.
I
Right.
miss it. I walk by there and whine looking at the place. So I'm glad to hear you're doing that.
I miss it so much. I mean, just I had such great times in there.
We should try to get in there and do an event. Hurry up and do that film. We'll figure out how to screen it in there.
But remember, it burned down probably 3 years ago.
There was a
And
fire in there?
there was a fire in there. They were filming Motherless Brooklyn, and the word on the street was that the something warm got too close to the old bottles, alcohol bottles down in the basement and caused this whole implosion. And so basically it's gone, and it looks like it's a construction site now where someone's building some apartment building or whatever. But I mean, that's wonderful, Marcia. We can figure out somewhere to do something.
Do something.
Do something, yeah.
Screen it on the street outside. Do
I
something.
would love it. Close down St. Nicholas Avenue on a Saturday and screen it. Mm-hmm.
I love that idea. Well, we are almost out of time, but I want to make sure that we get in a couple of questions from the audience. So Alston asks, what advice do you have for young independent filmmakers looking to include archival footage in their documentaries? Well, Austin, I will pass it on to my panelists, but as an archival researcher, I will just say that as much time as you think it will take, double or triple that, to try and source a piece of footage. And it really, to my experience, and I've been doing this about 10 years now, it really is a matter of accepting that it's a bit of a scavenger hunt and that it is a bit of just putting a real research push in. I can talk, I'm happy to talk more about that. I want to pass it off to the panelists just in case they have anything about sourcing footage, but I just wanted to put that out there.
I think that is excellent advice. And I would say, if you don't have money, you have to adopt that attitude. Absolutely. If you do have money, talk to Andrea or somebody who actually does this kind of work. And the last thing I'll say is don't pay for anything until you know exactly what you're going to use. Because you have to be, the prices are always negotiable, and they'll never tell you that they're actually negotiable. So don't pay for it till you have to, and negotiate. And if you don't need to pay for it for whatever you're using it for, then don't.
Thank you. There's also a question here from Maria. Are there any large projects in the works that can capture even more of these oral histories? So that's a bit more focused toward you, Karen. Do you have anything to add to that?
There's another project that I also have a few hours of oral histories in the can, so to speak, but I don't want to say what that is right now because I'm being totally superstitious, but it has to do with Black liberation. That's all I'll say.
Well, I also think this is a really good time to point out that in an interview, William Greaves, who was the director of From These Roots, which is in the series, he mentions that he also had a film he wanted to make about the Harlem Renaissance, based almost entirely on oral histories that he conducted in the 1970s at this very fancy cocktail party for the people who were still around from the days of the Harlem Renaissance. And although that did not happen in his lifetime, that footage is still out there somewhere. And so
Wow.
I think that that would be an amazing, amazing project to have access to at some point. And there's a final question here, which I think is a great question to wrap up with. And it is, what is your favorite corner of Harlem and why?
I'll answer that question. And also I didn't get to answer the last question about the challenges that we face. So because we are a relatively new organization and nonprofit, we are not well funded, even though we do a lot of work. You know, I've sold basically all of my personal assets to make sure that the vision thrives. So what can be done is that we ask for large organizations and the populace just to support your arts organizations. You can support ours at harlemfilmhouse.org or Firelight or Karen, but it is essential that people understand that the majority of Black nonprofit arts organizations are not well funded. I have sold my house, 3 cars, and so on and so forth to make sure this works because I care. And we need the support. We need the help. We need for people to understand that these things do not happen in a vacuum, and that the messages that are funded usually go to the same players all the time. There are those of us that are really out here doing work, and we need funding and support too. How we pivoted after COVID was based on my technical skill, and because I know how to code, and I was able to create virtual cinemas and do all of these things. But there are a lot of my counterparts that were not, and their business is closed. Less than 1% of female-led arts organizations are funded via grants. And that's something that needs to be looked at. There's tons of money out here and we are not getting it. But I see like a lot of other organizations get it that maybe aren't, I don't want to say they aren't doing as much because it's not a competition, but there's enough to go around. If we can do global programming with the $80,000 that I'm able to raise by the skin of my teeth personally, and go to different countries and talk to women and teach them film and entrepreneurism, imagine what I could do with 250,000. You understand what I'm saying? So those things have to be addressed, particularly when we get into these things. Now, my favorite part of Harlem, obviously Esplanade Gardens, where I grew up. 125th Street can't be beat. In the 90s, I am hip hop baby, I'm a hip hop generation, but understand that hip hop culture, just before we go out and I wanna wrap this, is to say hip hop culture is Black culture. Rap is music. Please stop getting it too confused. Rap is music, hip hop is a culture. It is the renaming of Black culture. It is now the most popular culture on the planet, and we own none of it. So when you hear us say hip hop culture, hip hop film festival, that's another way of saying Black, y'all. So all of Harlem is my stomping ground. It's my favorite spot. I'm done.
I'd have to say that my favorite street in Harlem is Convent Avenue. I just think it's so gorgeous. Just the architecture, the wideness of the street, the trees. That's one of my favorite streets in Harlem, Convent Avenue. I used to live 148th and Convent, so maybe that has something to do with it.
I say 125th on a Saturday.
Yes.
I mean, it really can't be beat. That was going to be mine too. When I want to be quiet, I have a very specific rock in St. Nick Park that I go to. So that's for quiet Andrea, who needs time to herself. That is her favorite spot. But to walk the breadth of 125th, which at one point was called the Boulevard of Dreams, to walk that east to west all the way to the river, you will see 1,000 stories. And you just really can't beat that.
Am I the only one that used to play dominoes by the State Building or spades? Am I the only one who used to do that with my crew?
I grew up in Brooklyn, okay, I can't.
Oh.
But it's funny when I was
Harlem in the 90s, when the State Building before, was it Giuliani? Before Giuliani got rid of all the African vendors,
yeah.
and we would go fresh out of high school and go sit at the tables around the State Building and they had the tables and it was made out for checkers or chess, but you could play dominoes, you could play spades. And then like at about 10 o'clock, you come out with your best fits and you walk up and down by the Apollo, go to Perks, have a purple MF. Yeah, I'm Harlem for real. I'm Harlem for real. I remember Perks. Yeah.
Perks.
And I had no business being in there. I was sneaking in there, but nobody told me. Let's go.
I love that note to end on. I'm Harlem for real. All right, everyone, thank you so much for joining us tonight. I want to mention that the Made in Harlem series, Reconsidering Harlem, Legacies and Futures, will be playing through March 19th. So if you haven't already, please take a look at the films and join us for part 2 of Made in Harlem, which will be available later this year. Thank you to Maysles Documentary Center, and good night.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.